Imagine a huge mansion with more rooms than most people will ever see in their whole lives. Picture long, echoing hallways, glittering marble floors, and walls covered with famous paintings by the greatest artists who ever lived. Now, picture that same house today. Windows smashed, ceilings falling in, rain pouring through the roof, and graffiti sprayed over ruined walls where priceless art once hung. And this is Lynnewood Hall, and this is the story of how one of America's grandest mansions went from almost unbelievable luxury to heartbreaking ruin in less than 100 years. It's not just a story about a building, it's a story about dreams, pride, love, and terrible loss. It's about a powerful family who thought they had everything, and then watched it all slip away because of one cold night in 1912, in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. It's about how money can buy almost anything, except safety from tragedy. The ghost of a palace. Today, if you drive through Elkins Park, a wealthy suburb outside Philadelphia, and look behind a rusted iron fence and overgrown bushes, you'll see something strange. Hidden behind trees and tall grass stands a giant stone building that looks like a haunted palace. It doesn't glow with light, no music plays inside, no guests arrive in fancy clothes. This is Lynnewood Hall, and for more than 70 years, it has been slowly dying. When it was completed in 1897, almost everyone in America who followed high society knew its name. At that time, this place wasn't a ghost at all. It was a symbol of power and success. Built during the height of the Gilded Age, it had 110 rooms and around 70,000 square feet of space. It was designed like a grand French chateau, but made even larger and more dramatic to fit American ambitions. In simple terms, it was like someone took a European royal palace and turned the volume up. To understand Lynnewood Hall, you have to think about the Gilded Age at its very peak. This was the era when industrial giants in America were richer than many kings. Railroads, steel, oil, and streetcars created fortunes so huge that it's hard to even imagine them now. These men weren't just rich, they were mega rich, and they wanted everyone to see it. Andrew Carnegie had his castle in Scotland. George Vanderbilt had his Biltmore estate in North Carolina. And Peter A.B. Widener, a streetcar tycoon from Philadelphia, decided he would build his own American Versailles just outside his hometown. He chose a young architect named Horace Trumbauer to help make it real. A house built to impress the world. The numbers alone sound unreal. 110 rooms. But these weren't small bedrooms or plain sitting rooms. These were rooms with 20-foot ceilings, walls covered in silk fabric brought over from France, and floors made of rare marble from Italy. Imagine walking into a house where everything feels larger than life. The main staircase was carved from a single huge piece of marble. It rose up 3 stories and was so wide that 10 people could walk side by side without bumping shoulders. Walking down those steps in an evening gown or tuxedo must have felt like walking into a royal court. There was a ballroom big enough to host 300 people for dinner and still leave space for an orchestra and dancing afterward. There were 62 bathrooms. This was in the 1890s when many Americans still used outhouses in their backyards. At Lynnewood Hall, there was hot and cold running water, porcelain fixtures, and even heated towel racks. There was an indoor swimming pool with fancy tile work that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. There was a bowling alley, a gym, a private theater where the family could watch performances without leaving home. But the most astonishing thing wasn't the marble or the bathrooms. It was what hung on the walls. A palace built for paintings. Peter A.B. Widener was not just rich. He was also one of the greatest art collectors in American history. Lynnewood Hall wasn't only a home. It was a personal museum built to hold his treasures. Inside its galleries hung original paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Van Dyck, Raphael, Donatello, Botticelli, Titian, El Greco, and many more. These weren't copies or cheap imitations. These were real masterpieces, the kind of art you expect to see behind glass in a famous European museum, not in someone's private house. In some rooms, the paintings on the walls were worth more than entire city blocks. The house itself was designed by Horace Trumbauer, a Philadelphia architect who was only 27 when Peter Widener hired him. Trumbauer hadn't gone to an expensive architecture school. He couldn't afford it. Instead, he started working at 16 as a draftsman, drawing plans and learning by watching and doing. He studied great buildings the way Widener studied paintings, carefully, obsessively, and with real passion. By his mid-20s, Horace Trumbauer had his own firm and had designed nice homes for wealthy clients. But nothing prepared him for what happened when Peter A.B. Widener walked into his office and said, in effect, "I want a palace. Money is no object. Make it magnificent. Make it last forever. Show everyone I've arrived." For a young architect, this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. How a young architect created a masterpiece. Instead of panicking, Horace Trumbauer did what he always did. He studied. He traveled to Europe with sketchbook in hand. He walked through Versailles and other French chateaux, studying the exact proportions of windows and doors. He looked at Italian palazzos, English country houses, and German castles. He filled notebooks with sketches of staircases, columns, ceilings, and the way sunlight entered certain rooms. But he didn't just copy what he saw. He combined the best ideas into something new. A neoclassical palace for an American millionaire who had grown rich not from royal blood, but from streetcars and meat contracts. The result was Lynnewood Hall. Imagine driving down a long tree-lined road. Slowly, the top of the building appears. Then you see the massive columns at the front. Finally, the whole 3-story facade comes into view, stretching wider than your eyes expect, built from Indiana limestone that glows like honey in the afternoon sun. It wasn't meant to be modest or shy. It was meant to take your breath away. Inside, the entrance hall alone was larger than most people's entire houses. The floors were patterned marble. The walls rose 2 stories high, covered with detailed plasterwork. The ceiling was decorated by Italian craftsmen who had spent years learning their trade. And at the center was that marble staircase, sweeping up and splitting into 2 grand flights, so that anyone walking down it looked like a king or queen entering a throne room. Every major room had a purpose beyond simple living. The ballroom told visitors that the Widener family could entertain hundreds anytime they wanted. The grand library, lined with dark wood and tall shelves, told guests that this family cared about books, learning, and culture. And the art galleries were designed like professional museum spaces with perfect light and carefully planned views so that each painting would be shown at exactly the right angle. Yet Trumbauer also understood that a house this huge could feel cold and empty. So he designed small, cozy rooms tucked inside all this grand architecture. There were warm sitting rooms where the family could drink coffee in the morning, breakfast rooms overlooking the gardens, private studies where Peter Widener could read and think in peace. In these spaces, the house could feel like a home, not just a stage. Lynnewood Hall was built with the newest technology too. It had central heating powered by big coal boilers in the basement. It had electric lights, a private phone system that connected rooms, and even 2 elevators, one for the family, one for servants and deliveries. In 1897, this was high-tech living. Hundreds of workers, stonemasons, plasterers, carvers, and craftsmen from different countries worked for 3 years to bring Trumbauer's designs to life. When the mansion was finally finished, Horace Trumbauer was only 30 years old. He had already created the greatest work of his career. The house seemed ready to stand for centuries. No one imagined how quickly everything would fall apart. The boy from a bricklayer's family. To understand why Lynnewood Hall existed at all, we have to look at the man who paid for it, Peter Errol Brown Widener. Peter A.B. Widener was born in Philadelphia in 1834. His father laid bricks for a living. His mother earned extra money by sewing. They lived in a small house in a working-class neighborhood, like many families in the city. There was no sign that their son would someday be one of the richest men in America. At 13, Peter quit school to help support his family. He worked as an errand boy and then in a butcher shop. By 19, he had saved enough to buy his own small butcher shop. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. Then history changed his life. The Civil War broke out, and Peter Widener got a contract to supply meat to the Union Army. It was hard work, buying cattle, slaughtering them, and moving meat to army camps, but it was also extremely profitable. Widener was tough, organized, and not afraid to make hard choices. By the end of the war, he had enough money to start investing. He noticed something many people ignored. In the 1870s, American cities were growing fast, and people needed a way to travel from their homes to jobs and shops. Horse-drawn streetcars were becoming the main way to move around crowded streets. Most people saw them as a normal business. Peter Widener saw them as the future. He started buying streetcar lines in Philadelphia, combining them into a powerful system. He made them more efficient and used his sharp business sense and his political connections to gain control. When electric streetcars began to replace horses in the 1880s, Widener was already perfectly placed. He owned the lines and had the cash to modernize them. He didn't stop with Philadelphia. He invested in streetcar systems and elevated trains in cities like Chicago, New York, and Baltimore. He bought rivals, pushed others out of business, and formed trusts that cut down competition. Workers often hated him for low wages. Reformers called him corrupt. Other businessmen feared him. But Peter A.B. Widener believed this was simply how the Gilded Age worked. Andrew Carnegie dominated steel. John D. Rockefeller dominated oil. Widener dominated urban transportation. If you didn't crush your rivals, they would crush you. By the 1890s, Peter Widener was one of the 20 richest men in the United States. His fortune may have been between $50 and $100 million back then, equal to billions today. He sat on the boards of major companies and influenced banks, utilities, and industries across the country. His opinion could make or break a business. A robber baron who loved beauty. But there was something different about Peter A.B. Widener compared to some other Gilded Age tycoons. He genuinely loved art and culture. He had left school at 13, but he never stopped learning. He read widely. He went to Europe again and again, walking through museums and private collections. He didn't just buy whatever was expensive. He studied, asked questions, and trained his eye to recognize quality. He hired experts to advise him, but he also trusted his own judgment. When he decided to build Lynnewood Hall, it wasn't only to show off money. He wanted a home worthy of the great paintings and sculptures he was collecting. In many ways, the house was a museum where a family happened to live. On the first floor, he created public gallery rooms, specially planned to show his masterpieces: Rembrandt, Vermeer, Raphael, Donatello, and more. He wanted to live surrounded by beauty and to raise his children and grandchildren inside a world of culture, not just cash. His personal life seemed equally successful. His wife Hannah was calm and practical, running the household and raising their children. Two of their sons grew to adulthood, George and Joseph. Both worked in the family businesses. George Widener married Eleanor Elkins, the daughter of another extremely rich Philadelphia family, which joined the two families' power. Joseph Widener married Ella Pancoast, who also came from a wealthy background. Children and grandchildren filled the family tree. Names like Harry, Eleanor Jr., Fitz, and George Jr. promised a lasting dynasty. When Lynnewood Hall opened in 1897, Peter A.B. Widener was 63 years old and at the absolute top of his world. He had wealth, influence, a spectacular mansion, a loving family, and a collection of art that museums envied. It seemed like he had built something that would last forever. That belief turned out to be his biggest mistake, a priceless collection in a fragile house. Walk into Lynnewood Hall around the year 1900, and you would be stepping into one of the greatest private art museums on Earth. In one gallery, an original Rembrandt, not a print, hung on the wall, worth more than most people could earn in 10 lifetimes. Nearby, a rare Vermeer, one of only a few dozen he ever painted, looked out quietly from its frame. Van Dyck's portraits of European nobles stared down with proud faces. A tender Raphael Madonna, a Donatello sculpture, and works by Botticelli, Titian, and El Greco lined the rooms. Everywhere you turned, there was something a museum director would dream of owning. Peter Widener didn't collect by accident. He studied art history, hired real experts, and traveled to buy from old noble families in Europe who were running out of money and selling their treasures. When an important painting came up for sale, Widener could simply outbid everyone else. He focused on old masters, works from the 15th to 17th centuries. These were not trendy artists of the moment. These were painters whose greatness had been agreed on for hundreds of years. A Rembrandt would always be valuable. A Vermeer would always matter. So Widener's collection was both cultural and financial, beauty and investment at the same time. The crown jewel of the collection was a painting called The Mill by Rembrandt. It showed a windmill under a dramatic sky, and Widener paid a record-breaking $500,000 for it in 1911, equivalent to many millions today. He hung it in a main gallery so every guest would see it first. It was his proudest possession. He didn't only buy paintings, he collected Chinese porcelain from the Ming and Qing dynasties, sculptures from the Renaissance, medieval manuscripts, royal furniture, and tapestries that had hung in European castles. Almost every room in Lynnewood contained something rare and important. His sons shared his interest. George Widener became an expert in miniature portraits and rare books. His son Harry fell especially in love with beautiful and rare volumes. By his 20s, Harry Widener had built an incredible collection, early editions, manuscripts, and treasures that serious scholars longed to study. He dreamed of someday giving his books to Harvard University and building a grand library in his name. But the very thing that made the collection special also made it vulnerable. It wasn't kept in a heavily protected museum with guards and alarm systems. It was kept in a private home. Yes, there were gates and servants, but in the end, it was still just a house. By 1912, experts guessed that the Widener art collection was worth between $5 and $10 million, a gigantic amount back then. It was one of the finest private collections in America, rivaling those of men like J.P. Morgan and Henry Clay Frick. Peter Widener, now 78, could walk through his galleries and know that he had accomplished everything he set out to do. He had risen from a butcher shop to the top of the world. He had created a palace filled with wonder. His sons were successful. His grandchildren were promising. It must have felt like nothing could shake what he had built. And then came the Titanic. A family at the top of the world. In the spring of 1912, the Widener family seemed untouchable. Peter Widener, 78, still took an interest in business, but spent more time at Lynnewood, enjoying the art he had collected. His wife Hannah kept the huge household running smoothly with around 60 servants. Their son George was 50 and seemed like the perfect heir. He was a skilled businessman who had helped expand the family fortune, and a cultured man who appreciated art and books. His wife, Eleanor Elkins Widener, was intelligent and stylish, and came from one of the best families in Philadelphia. Together, they moved easily in high society. Their son Harry, now 27, was Harvard-educated and obsessed with rare books. He talked constantly about building a library for Harvard that would hold his collection. Harry seemed to have the same burning passion for books that his grandfather had for streetcars and art. The family traveled like American royalty. When they took trains, they used private rail cars with bedrooms, sitting rooms, and dining areas paneled in polished wood. When they arrived in New York, the best hotels welcomed them. When they sailed to Europe, they booked first-class cabins on the finest ships. At Lynnewood Hall, life was carefully choreographed. Breakfast was served on expensive china. Mornings might be spent in the library or galleries. Afternoons could be for business meetings, social calls, or drives in horse-drawn carriages and, later, luxury automobiles. Evenings often meant large dinners with powerful guests. Behind the scenes, servants cleaned, cooked, and carried, making life seem effortless for the family. George and Eleanor had 3 children, Harry, Eleanor Jr., and Fitz, plus George Jr. The younger children were growing up surrounded by servants, art, and endless comfort. To them, the mansion was just home, but no amount of comfort could protect them from what was coming. That spring, George decided to take Eleanor and Harry on a trip to Europe. They would visit art galleries, buy new pieces for their collections, and enjoy Paris and London in the springtime. When it was time to return home, they booked passage on a brand new ship, the largest, most luxurious ocean liner ever built, RMS Titanic. Of course, they traveled first class, a floating palace at sea. On April 10, 1912, the Wideners boarded Titanic at Cherbourg, France. Their first-class suite was as luxurious as any top hotel. The dining room was famous for its fine food. Other first-class passengers included some of the richest and most important people in America: John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidore and Ada Strauss, co-owner of Macy's. For people like George and Eleanor, this felt almost normal. These were their peers. Harry Widener was thrilled. In London, he had bought a rare book by Francis Bacon, an edition from the 1500s that he treasured. He carried it with him everywhere. On board, he met other educated passengers and spent hours in the ship's library talking about books and plans for the future. Maybe he'd start on that library sooner than he thought. Eleanor enjoyed the trip in her own way, shopping in the ship's boutiques, writing letters, and socializing. Everyone recognized the Widener name. People wanted to be seen talking to them. The trip was both exciting and exhausting. George relaxed more than he could at home. Away from constant business pressures, he could simply spend time with his wife and son, dine formally, and walk the decks under the open sky. On the night of April 14th, George and Eleanor hosted a dinner party at the ship's a la carte restaurant. The food was rich, the wine expensive, and the conversation lively. Important people came by their table. Captain Edward Smith stopped to chat. It felt like any other luxurious evening in their world. At some point, Harry excused himself. He was tired and wanted to read his precious Francis Bacon book in his cabin. His father teased him for always having his nose in a book. His mother kissed his cheek goodnight. They would see him in the morning. None of them knew that this was the last time they would be together. At 11:40 p.m., Titanic hit an iceberg. Women and children first. At first, the impact didn't seem terrifying. Passengers felt a strange shudder and a slight grinding noise, but the huge ship didn't suddenly tilt or throw people around. Many people kept eating, drinking, and talking. The ship was supposed to be unsinkable. That idea had been repeated so often that people believed it without question. But below the waterline, the iceberg had ripped open the hull. Soon stewards moved through the ship, asking passengers to put on life jackets and go up on deck, as a precaution. There was still no screaming, no rush. People joked and wondered what was happening. In the Widener's suite, George and Eleanor prepared to go on deck. They told the steward to fetch Harry. They put on warmer clothes and coats. Somewhere in that confusion, they understood that something might be seriously wrong. On deck, the situation slowly turned from confusing to terrifying. Lifeboats were being uncovered. Officers were shouting orders. The ship began to tilt ever so slightly. The cold night air bit into faces and hands. The sea around them was black and endless. There was one rule everyone knew: women and children first. For wealthy men like George and famous men like John Jacob Astor, this rule meant something important. In their world, honor required that they accept danger so others could live. Getting into a lifeboat while women waited on deck would be seen as cowardly. An officer approached Eleanor and told her it was time to get into a boat. George understood immediately. He pulled his wife forward, insisting she had to go. She resisted, not wanting to leave him and Harry behind. She still believed this would all work out. Maybe they were overreacting, maybe they would all be rescued together. But George thought of their younger children back at Lynnewood Hall, Eleanor Jr., Fitz, and George Jr. They needed their mother. He told her so. He insisted. His voice grew firm. She had to go. Harry, still clutching his rare Francis Bacon book, tried to hand it to his mother so she could keep it safe. She refused and told him to keep it. She still could not accept that they might not see each other again. In the end, George practically lifted Eleanor into the lifeboat. The boat began to lower into the freezing dark. As she dropped away from the deck, she looked up. George tried to smile, to look calm and strong. Harry raised a hand and waved. They were trying to comfort her, to act as if they would all be together again soon. It was the last time she ever saw them, the night the unsinkable ship disappeared. As lifeboats went down into the water, many were not even full. People didn't want to leave the apparent safety of the huge ship for a small boat in the ocean. Some still thought everything would be fine. On deck, men smoked, talked, and pretended not to be worried. The band kept playing cheerful music. It was a strange mix of calm and panic. George and Harry Widener stayed together, along with their loyal manservant, Edwin Keeping, who refused to leave their side. They helped other women into boats. They waited as more and more lifeboats lowered away. The ship's angle grew steeper. Water reached more decks. Now, nobody could pretend everything was fine. Around 2:00 a.m., the bow of Titanic sank under the surface. The stern rose high into the air. People slipped and slid along the deck as it tilted. Some jumped into the water. George and Harry may have spoken quietly about home, about Lynnewood, about future plans that would never happen. Or they may have said nothing, knowing that words could change nothing. We can't know what passed between them in those final minutes. At 2:20 a.m., the ship broke in half. Lights flickered and went out. The stern, where many still clung, rose straight up and then plunged downward. The people still on board were thrown into the sea. The water was around 28 degrees. In such cold, you don't last long. Your muscles freeze, your heart struggles. Most people die within minutes from cold shock and hypothermia, not drowning slowly. George Widener, Harry Widener, and Edwin Keeping all perished in that black, icy water, along with more than 1,500 others. Far away in lifeboat number 4, Eleanor Widener watched the gigantic ship's lights vanish into the darkness and heard the screams of hundreds of people in the water. Those sounds would stay with her for the rest of her life. Other women in the boat also watched, waiting and hoping their husbands and sons might somehow appear. Some people wanted to go back for survivors, but most boats stayed away, afraid they would be overturned by desperate swimmers. So they drifted in the cold and dark, listening until the screams finally faded. At dawn, the ship Carpathia arrived and started picking up lifeboats. Eleanor was lifted aboard, given tea and warm clothing by strangers. She searched the faces of survivors again and again. No George, no Harry. They were now 2 of the most famous victims of the most famous shipwreck in history. A widow in a palace of ghosts. Back in Philadelphia, in Lynnewood Hall, life went on for a short time, as if nothing had happened. Servants still polished silver and dusted paintings. The gardens were still tended. The marble floors still gleamed. No one had yet told the house that its masters were gone. Then the telegrams arrived. Peter A.B. Widener, 78 years old, learned that his son George and his grandson Harry were dead. The man who had survived countless business battles, who had built a fortune out of nothing, now faced something he could not fix or control. Money couldn't bring them back. Art couldn't change it. Lynnewood Hall, with all its beauty, might as well have been made of paper. 3 weeks after the disaster, Eleanor Widener returned to Philadelphia with her younger children. The newspapers had written endlessly about the sinking. Everyone already knew who had lived and who had died. But seeing Eleanor step off the train alone, without George and Harry, made the loss real for the family in a new and painful way. They drove through the gates of Lynnewood Hall. The same building stood there, untouched by tragedy. The limestone still shone in the sunlight. The gardens were still neat. Everything looked exactly as it had before. Inside the front door, Peter Widener met his daughter-in-law. In just a few weeks, he seemed older. The proud, powerful man was now a grieving father and grandfather. He embraced Eleanor, and the 2 people who had lost the most tried to comfort each other, even though there were no words that could truly help. The servants had prepared for her arrival. Her room was ready. Fresh flowers sat in vases. Her favorite tea waited on a tray. They wanted to make things easier, but nothing could make this situation normal. Now the house felt wrong. Everywhere Eleanor went, memories flashed around her. The breakfast room, where Harry once read through meals. The library where George smoked and talked with guests after dinner. The galleries where the 3 of them had admired paintings together. All of those rooms were still there, still decorated and still perfect. But the people she loved were gone. The servants didn't know what to say. Should they mention George and Harry or stay quiet? Should they pretend things were ordinary or show their sorrow? Many chose silence. It felt safer than saying the wrong thing. Peter Widener tried to distract himself with business, but it no longer mattered the way it once had. He had built an empire, and now his main heir was gone. Joseph, his other son, was still there and capable, but George had been the one most aligned with his father's ideas and interests. Lynnewood Hall had always been meant for George. Now, instead of feeling like a bright symbol of success, the mansion felt like a tomb, building a library from grief. While grief consumed the family, life still had to continue in some way. The younger children needed care. Laws had to be handled. Wills and estates had to be settled. There were endless meetings with lawyers and business partners. Eleanor Widener struggled under the weight of her loss and her guilt. She had survived. Her husband and oldest son had not. People told her she had done the only thing she could. She had followed the rule of women and children first. George had insisted she get in the boat, but logic did not erase the feeling that she had left them behind. One thing gave her a sense of purpose. Harry had dreamed of giving his book collection to Harvard and building a library. He had talked about it constantly. Now, he would never do it himself. So, Eleanor decided she would do it for him. She worked with Harvard University to design and build a new library, the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library. It would be large, beautiful, and filled with books, including those her son had collected. Scholars would use it for generations. Her son would be remembered not just as a victim of the Titanic, but as someone who loved learning and helped others to learn. The project gave Eleanor something to pour her energy into. It was a way to create meaning out of tragedy. Peter Widener supported the idea. He understood the urge to make something permanent in a world that suddenly felt fragile, but no building, no matter how grand, could fully heal their hearts. In 1915, just 3 years after the sinking of Titanic, Peter A.B. Widener died. Officially, it was age and illness, but many people believe sadness and heartbreak played a part. The man who had built Lynnewood Hall, who had collected so much art and imagined such a long-lasting legacy, left the world knowing that his carefully planned family dynasty had been shattered. Lynnewood Hall continued to exist. Hannah, Peter's widow, and Eleanor still lived there for a time. The servants still kept things running, but the house no longer felt like a joyful center of life. It was becoming something else, a beautiful shell surrounding pain, an expensive problem no one wants. After Peter's death, Joseph Widener inherited most of the estate. He had his own interests, his own house, and his own life. Lynnewood Hall had always been intended for George. Now it was a heavy responsibility. Keeping a mansion like Lynnewood was incredibly expensive. The taxes were high, the heating bills were huge, the staff needed salaries, the building constantly needed repairs. It was like owning a small hotel that only your family used. Meanwhile, America was changing. World War I, new tax laws and social shifts made giant houses like Lynnewood harder to maintain and, in the eyes of many people, more inappropriate. During the Great Depression, when millions were out of work and standing in bread lines, a house with 110 rooms and dozens of bathrooms looked almost offensive. By the 1930s, Lynnewood Hall had become an awkward reminder of an older era. Joseph tried a compromise. He did not move into the house full-time, but he did not immediately sell or abandon it either. Lynnewood became partly a warehouse for the family's remaining art, and partly a rarely used residence. The staff was greatly reduced. Whole sections of the mansion were closed off, covered in dust sheets, and left in darkness for months at a time. Gardens that once required many gardeners now had only a few workers, and wildness began to creep in. The most important paintings and sculptures were still there, but Joseph faced a hard question. Should such great art stay hidden in a half-empty private house? Or should it go to museums where the public could see it? In 1937, Joseph Widener made a major decision. He gave some of the best pieces in the collection, including masterpieces by Rembrandt and Vermeer, to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which was being created at the time. These works would now be protected and displayed for millions of visitors. The Widener name would live on inside the museum. But this choice also confirmed something else. The original dream for Lynnewood was over. The house was no longer the family's central showcase for culture. Without the art, it was just a very large, very expensive old building. After World War II, things got even worse. Estate taxes increased sharply. Servants became harder to hire, since people could get better wages and more freedom in factories and offices. Society was moving away from the world that had created houses like Lynnewood. By the 1950s, the mansion was effectively abandoned. It was still owned on paper, but no one lived there. The staff disappeared. Windows broke and were not replaced. The roof began to leak. Tree roots cracked old paths. The once perfect house was now a giant, slowly rotting shell. A palace had turned into a problem nobody knew how to solve. Decay, vandalism, and silence. Empty buildings attract trouble. Soon, vandals and thrill-seekers discovered Lynnewood Hall. They climbed over fences or slipped through broken doors and explored the darkened rooms. Some were curious photographers who wanted to capture the ruined beauty. Others were simply destructive. They smashed windows, spray-painted walls, and tore down what they could. They stole anything easy to carry, fixtures, metal, smaller decorative items. They chipped at the marble staircase, broke delicate carvings, and ripped out copper pipes to sell as scrap. The same intricate plasterwork that Italian craftsmen had spent months creating was smashed in minutes by people with hammers and no respect for the past. Local preservation groups were horrified. They knew that Lynnewood Hall was Horace Trumbauer's greatest work and one of the finest Gilded Age mansions left standing. They wrote letters, gave talks, and tried to raise money. They begged the Widener heirs to sell or donate the house so it could be saved. But the situation was tangled with trusts, taxes, and legal issues. The family either refused or delayed, saying it was complicated. Meanwhile, the weather kept doing damage. Every time it rained, water leaked through the roof into upper rooms. It soaked into wood, caused mold, and made plaster fall. In winter, water froze and expanded, cracking stone and concrete. Year by year, Lynnewood rotted from the top down and the bottom up. By the late 20th century, large parts of the roof had collapsed. Some floors were so weak that anyone walking on them risked falling through. The basement flooded regularly. The once bright ballroom looked like a bomb had hit it. The gardens turned into a small forest. Urban explorers posted haunting photos online. Grand staircases covered in graffiti, ballrooms full of rubble, long hallways open to the sky. People around the world were shocked that such a rare and historic building was being allowed to rot. But shock did not fix the roof. The ruin no one can quite fix. Standing outside Lynnewood Hall today feels a bit like standing at a crime scene. The ornate iron gates are chained and rusted. The driveway is cracked and overgrown with weeds. Trees and bushes block the view, as if the house is trying to hide. When you do finally see the building, it's heartbreaking. The stonework is stained dark with dirt and moss. Most of the windows are broken or boarded up with rotting wood. Parts of the roof are gone entirely. In some places, you can look through a hole in the roof, through collapsed floors, and see the sky from the ground level. Inside, the damage is even worse. The entrance hall, once polished and perfect, now has cracked and stained floors. The silk fabric that once covered the walls hangs in shreds or has vanished entirely. Spray paint covers many surfaces, not beautiful murals, just messy tags and rude words. The famous marble staircase still stands because marble does not rot, but it is scarred with chips and graffiti. Some of the carved balusters are broken or missing. The ballroom floor has partly collapsed into the basement below. Birds and animals come and go through broken windows. The art galleries are empty. The special lighting that Trumbauer designed means nothing now. There is no electricity, no paintings, only damaged walls and shattered glass. Rain and snow fall through broken skylights. The library where George and Harry once talked eagerly about books is one of the saddest spaces. The shelves are still there, but warped and moldy. The books they once held have long since been given away, sold, or moved. The room that once held conversations about rare editions and future libraries is now filled with silence and mildew. Below the main floors, the servants' areas and mechanical rooms are filled with standing water. The old heating system is a pile of rust. The kitchens are stripped bare, every valuable metal fixture torn out. Outside, the formal gardens are a jungle. Paths vanish under dead leaves. Fountains are broken and filled with trash. Statues have been smashed or stolen. The carriage house and staff quarters are collapsing. Again and again, preservationists have tried to find a way to save Lynnewood Hall. They got it listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which makes demolition harder, but that doesn't bring in money. Developers have looked at the property and done the math. To restore the mansion, they would need tens of millions of dollars, maybe 50 million, maybe 100 million or more, and then they would still need to find a use that would bring in enough money every year to keep it alive. The location makes things harder. Lynnewood Hall sits in a quiet Philadelphia suburb, surrounded by regular houses and streets. It does not have thousands of acres around it, like Biltmore. It can't easily become a resort or huge tourist attraction with hotels and wineries. Turning it into condos would be extremely difficult and expensive. Turning it into a museum would require constant funding. Local neighbors are frustrated. The building is dangerous and ugly in its current state. Teenagers still try to sneak in. One day, someone could be seriously hurt by a falling ceiling or collapsing floor. But the town does not want to take ownership of a giant ruin that could cost more than its entire budget to fix. So, for years, Lynnewood Hall has been stuck. Too important to tear down, too damaged and expensive to restore, and too legally complicated to easily sell. It's like a patient kept alive on the thinnest thread, slowly fading away while everyone argues about what to do. A last chance and a hard question. In recent years, a businessman named Richard Yoon, or similarly spelled, depending on the source you read, stepped in and purchased Lynnewood Hall with a plan to restore it. The idea is to bring the building back to life as a museum and event space, and to build other structures nearby to help pay for its ongoing care. The project is enormous. The house needs a new roof, new windows, new wiring, new plumbing, new heating and cooling, and serious structural repairs. The plaster and marble need careful restoration. Every system that makes a building livable has to be rebuilt. The price tag could easily reach or pass $100 million. If it works, Lynnewood Hall may once again be filled with light, music, and visitors. It will never again be the private home of a single family, but it might become a place where people come to learn about the Gilded Age, architecture, art, and the Widener story. But there is a hard question here. Should it be saved? Some preservationists say yes. They argue that Lynnewood Hall is one of the last and greatest examples of a type of mansion that almost doesn't exist anymore. It is the masterpiece of Horace Trumbauer, a man whose work helped shape American architecture. Letting it collapse, they say, would be like throwing away a piece of our cultural memory. Others say no. They point out that the same amount of money could save many smaller historic buildings across the country. They note that Lynnewood Hall stood empty and abandoned for decades while so many people needed housing, or schools, or hospitals. They ask if spending so much to restore a symbol of extreme wealth is really the best use of limited resources. There is no simple answer. What is certain is that Lynnewood Hall stands for more than stone and plaster. It represents the rise of a man who came from nothing and built a vast fortune. It represents the Gilded Age belief that wealth and beauty could build a sort of personal paradise. It represents the way tragedy can smash even the strongest seeming lives. Peter A.B. Widener tried to build for eternity. He got less than 1 century before his dream house became a ruin. His son George and grandson Harry died in a single terrible night aboard Titanic. The mansion they were meant to inherit died slowly over many decades. One death was sudden and shocking. The other was slow and silent. America's forgotten Versailles. People sometimes call Lynnewood Hall America's forgotten Versailles. In some ways, it fits. Like the French palace, it was built to show the world what power and money could do. Like Versailles, it was filled with art and fine craftsmanship. But there is an important difference. When we look at the real Versailles in France, enough time has passed that the pain behind its history feels distant. The palace has become a museum, a beautiful relic of another age. We can enjoy its rooms without thinking too deeply about the suffering and inequality that made it possible. Lynnewood Hall is too recent for that kind of forgetting. It reminds us that these huge houses were built in a country where many people struggled just to survive. It reminds us that extreme wealth and extreme poverty existed side by side. It reminds us that the people who lived in these mansions were not simple villains, but complicated human beings who loved art, loved their children, and still could not escape heartbreak. We are often uncomfortable with stories like this. They don't fit easy categories of good and bad. It's easier to demolish the building or to let it rot and pretend that part of history never happened. But there is value in remembering. When you stand outside the rusted gates and look through the trees at this broken giant of a house, you are seeing more than cracked stone and broken glass. You are seeing the end of an era and the limits of wealth. You are seeing how quickly a perfect life can crumble, not only in a single night on an icy ocean, but slowly, quietly, over years of neglect and inaction. Peter A.B. Widener wanted Lynnewood Hall to stand for 1,000 years. It barely survived 100. The story of Lynnewood Hall is tragic, not because it burned dramatically or was blown up in one loud moment, but because it died, the way some dreams do, piece by piece, roof tile by roof tile, window by window, while people watched, argued, and did nothing. It is America's forgotten Versailles, rotting in the suburbs, caught between the past and the present, waiting to see whether it will be saved or whether time will quietly finish the work that tragedy began more than a century ago. New York City is famous for building upward, racing toward the sky with towers of steel and glass. But long before these modern buildings existed, the city once held a mansion so astonishing that many people believed it was the most beautiful private home ever constructed in Manhattan. It stood proudly along Riverside Drive, glowing with pink granite and decorated with carvings so detailed that passersby often slowed down just to stare. This grand palace was known as the Charles M. Schwab Mansion, a home built during a time when America's wealthiest families expressed their power, not through companies or bank accounts, but through unbelievable houses that looked as if they belonged in Europe. The mansion shimmered with elegance. Inside its 75 rooms, ceilings were painted by hand with colorful scenes that looked like they belonged inside a royal palace. The floors were covered with tiny handmade mosaics that reflected light from sparkling chandeliers. The walls were wrapped in dark mahogany wood, an expensive silk brought from overseas. Every room felt like its own world. Outside, the gardens designed by Charles Welford Levitt created a peaceful space that separated the home from the noise of the growing city. To the people who lived in New York, the mansion felt like a reminder of the Gilded Age, a moment in history when money seemed endless and luxury seemed normal. Yet the story of this mansion ends in a way no one could have expected. A building so admired, so costly, and so enormous eventually vanished under the swing of demolition machines. Instead of a palace, an ordinary apartment building stands on the spot today. To understand how something so magnificent could disappear, we must learn about the man behind it. His rise, his dreams, his troubles, and his downfall shaped the fate of the mansion more than any architect or builder ever could. The boy who grew into a steel giant, Charles M. Schwab. Charles M. Schwab was not born into wealth. He came into the world in 1862 in a small Pennsylvania town where his father made blankets and his family lived simply. When Charles was old enough to work, he joined the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, a factory owned by the powerful industrial leader Andrew Carnegie. The steel mill was loud, hot, and exhausting, but Charles watched everything carefully and learned quickly. He understood machines, schedules, and the difficult tasks that pushed steel workers to their limits. What made Charles different from many workers was his personality. He was warm, friendly, and respectful. He knew how to encourage people and make them feel valued. These qualities helped him rise through the ranks until he eventually became president of Carnegie Steel, one of the most important industrial companies in America. His success continued when he became the first president of U.S. Steel, created by the influential financier J.P. Morgan. Later, he took charge of Bethlehem Steel, which grew into the country's second-largest steel company. By the time he reached middle age, Charles was one of the wealthiest men in the nation, admired for his leadership and his bold decisions. A marriage that shaped both their lives. In 1883, long before the mansion existed, Charles married Emma Urania Dinky, whom many close friends called Rana. She grew up in Weatherly, Pennsylvania, living a quiet life far different from the glamorous events she would later attend. When she married Charles, her world changed rapidly. She found herself surrounded by wealthy guests, glittering dinner parties, elegant dresses, and important social gatherings. Even though her life changed dramatically, Rana adapted with grace and loyalty. She supported Charles not only as a partner, but also as a thoughtful advisor. Whenever Charles considered a major business decision, he often discussed it with Rana. One of the most famous examples happened when he was offered an enormous sum, $50 million, for part of Bethlehem Steel. Instead of deciding alone, he asked Rana for her opinion. This moment revealed how deeply he respected her judgment. Their marriage was not simply about attending grand events. It was a partnership that shaped the direction of their fortune, the first taste of grandeur. Before Charles imagined the mansion on Riverside Drive, he lived in a remarkable house in Braddock, Pennsylvania. It was made of brick and sandstone, with wide porches and elegant stained glass windows. Inside, oak panels decorated the walls, grand staircases connected the floors, and fireplaces displayed ornate carvings. On the grounds, there were tennis courts and a greenhouse that reflected the family's growing status. This earlier home became a place where Charles learned what he loved in architecture. He discovered the importance of natural light, materials that felt rich to the touch, and spaces large enough to impress even the wealthiest visitors. But as his success grew, so did his desire to build something even more extraordinary. He wanted a home that would outshine every mansion on Fifth Avenue and become a landmark of American wealth, choosing Riverside Drive instead of Fifth Avenue. Most wealthy families of the time built their grand homes on Fifth Avenue, where luxury stretched for blocks and society's elite gathered for events. But Charles had a different vision. He wanted a mansion that would stand alone, away from the competition and free to shine without comparison. This led him to select a large stretch of land on Riverside Drive between 73rd and 74th Streets, overlooking the Hudson River. At the time, this area was not considered fashionable, but Charles believed his mansion would transform the entire neighborhood. When Rana heard about the location, she felt uncertain. Her social life was tied to Central Park, Fifth Avenue, and the gatherings hosted by her friends. She worried that moving farther away from these familiar circles would leave her isolated, but Charles assured her that their new home would be so breathtaking that people would gladly come to them. He promised her a palace that would make visitors forget the distance, a bold architect for a bold dream. Instead of hiring a famous architect, Charles selected Maurice Hébert, a designer who had talent but not yet a major reputation. This decision surprised many people in New York. They wondered why a man with such a vast fortune would trust his biggest project to someone still rising in the field. But Charles believed strongly in giving opportunities to new minds, and he wanted a design that broke away from the familiar. The style chosen for the mansion was Beaux-Arts, a grand architectural approach inspired by classical Greek and Roman buildings, but combined with modern engineering. Beaux-Arts design required symmetry, enormous staircases, carved stone decorations, and powerful columns. It also demanded high quality in every detail, from the floors to the ceiling. For 4 long years, workers carved stone, installed marble, shaped columns, and added design after design until the mansion slowly grew into a spectacular work of art. People who passed the construction site often paused in amazement. Some compared it to a European castle. Others said it looked too beautiful to be real. The mansion rose so impressively that it seemed almost out of place among the other buildings on the street. But that was exactly what Charles wanted. A masterpiece of wealth and ambition. When the mansion was completed in 1906, it became one of the most remarkable private homes in America. Visitors entering through its doors stepped into a world that felt almost unreal. The ceilings were covered in hand-painted frescoes. The floors were made of shimmering mosaics that looked like carpets made of stone. The walls were lined with mahogany and silk, chosen specifically for their color and texture. Everywhere, the craftsmanship showed hours of careful work and unlimited spending. The mansion also contained spaces no ordinary home ever had. There was a private chapel large enough for a small orchestra, a billiard room designed for entertaining, an indoor pool lined with bright glazed bricks, a gym that seemed decades ahead of its time, and an art gallery filled with valuable pieces. It even had its own power plant and 6 elevators, luxuries rarely found in private homes during that era. The magnificence of the house was so great that even Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest men in the nation, admitted that Charles had surpassed him. He reportedly said that Charles's mansion made his own feel like a tiny cottage. Coming from a man known for immense wealth, these words prove just how extraordinary the Riverside Drive Palace truly was. A beautiful home, hiding deep personal struggles. But behind the shining marble and glowing chandeliers, the Schwab family faced challenges that grew heavier year after year. Charles loved living large. He threw enormous parties, traveled frequently, spent lavishly, and gambled with a boldness that both impressed and frightened his friends. His exciting lifestyle led to tremendous losses. His fortune, once estimated at millions upon millions of dollars, began to shrink. At the same time, Rana became more withdrawn. She rarely went out, refused invitations from important events, and avoided gatherings she once enjoyed. She gradually pulled away from society, finding comfort only inside the walls of her enormous home. Her health and confidence changed, and the mansion that once overflowed with laughter slowly turned into a quiet, lonely place. A final attempt to give the mansion purpose. During World War I, Rana opened the mansion to the American Red Cross. The same halls that once echoed with music now carried the footsteps of volunteers. Supplies replaced decorations, and the mansion briefly felt alive again, with a different kind of purpose. But when the war ended, the house returned to its silence. Then the Great Depression struck, and the Schwab fortune collapsed alongside the rest of the country. Maintaining the enormous house became impossible. Charles tried to sell the mansion, but no one wanted it. Even offering it for free did not convince the city to take the burden. When Charles finally left the mansion in 1939 and moved into a small apartment, it marked the end of an era. A year later, he passed away, leaving behind a house he could no longer afford. The quiet fall of a once great palace. The empty mansion stood quietly for years. It was too large for a family, too expensive for the city, and too complicated for any organization to use. Every new idea to save it collapsed under the weight of the building's enormous cost. In 1948, workers began removing valuable pieces from the interior. The carved doors, marble pillars, and ornate decorations were taken out and sent to places where they could be used again. Many of these pieces ended up in Our Lady of Lebanon Cathedral in Brooklyn, where they still exist today. After that, demolition began. The grand rooms that once amazed visitors fell piece by piece. The beautiful frescoes, the shining mosaics, the sweeping staircases, and the towering walls all disappeared. In their place rose a red brick apartment complex called the Schwab House, which still stands on Riverside Drive. The mansion that had once symbolized American wealth, ambition, and creativity now lives only in memories, photographs, and stories of the Gilded Age. The rise of the Vanderbilt Triple Palace. As the Schwab Mansion story fades into memory, another enormous chapter of New York's Gilded Age begins to rise. One even larger, even richer, and even more influential. This new story takes us to Fifth Avenue, the center of America's high society, where the mighty Vanderbilt family once ruled with unimaginable wealth. Long before skyscrapers filled the skyline, the Vanderbilt name carried a power that echoed through every railroad, bank, and ballroom in the country. Their fortune was so vast that newspapers called them the first family of American wealth, and their homes reflected that title with walls of marble, floors of gold, and ceilings painted like ancient palaces. Among all the incredible homes the Vanderbilts built, one mansion became the most ambitious of them all. It was called the Vanderbilt Triple Palace, a massive structure that stretched across an entire block of Fifth Avenue between 51st and 52nd Streets. It was not one home, but three gigantic houses connected together, built for one father and his daughters, standing side by side like a fortress of luxury. To understand why this unusual estate existed, we must learn about the man who created it. William Henry Vanderbilt, the eldest son of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the founder of the family fortune. Growing up in the shadow of a giant, William Henry Vanderbilt was born into a household unlike any other in America. His father, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had risen from poverty to become one of the richest individuals the world had ever known. He built his empire through ferries, steamships, and eventually railroads, particularly the powerful New York Central Railroad. By the time William Henry was old enough to understand the world, his father had already turned himself into a legend, respected for his brilliance and feared for his ruthlessness. Although he inherited his father's name, William Henry did not inherit his father's personality. He was quieter, more thoughtful, and much more gentle. He worked carefully, studied patiently, and made decisions slowly. This contrasted sharply with the aggressive, sharp-edged approach that made Cornelius famous. Because of that difference, Cornelius often criticized his son harshly. At times, he called William Henry a blockhead or accused him of lacking strength. These insults stayed with William Henry for years. Instead of letting them defeat him, he turned them into motivation. He worked harder than anyone expected. He studied business, learned how the railroads functioned, and strengthened his understanding of finance. He wanted to prove, to both himself and to the memory of his difficult father, that he could carry the Vanderbilt name with pride and success. A sudden inheritance that changed everything. In 1877, the unthinkable happened. Cornelius Vanderbilt died, leaving behind one of the greatest fortunes in American history. The bulk of this massive wealth, railroads, investments, companies, and cash, went directly to William Henry Vanderbilt. Overnight, he went from being a son striving for approval to becoming the richest man in the world. But with this new wealth came enormous responsibility. The Vanderbilt name was not just famous, it was powerful. People looked to William Henry for leadership, for decisions, and for the direction of the family's future. And he took that responsibility seriously. He immediately began strengthening the already vast railroad empire, expanding routes, improving operations, and increasing profits. Under his control, the Vanderbilt fortune grew even larger than what his father had created. Yet there was something more personal that William Henry wanted to build, something that would be physical, visible, and permanent. Something that would prove he could stand on his own, not as Cornelius's son, but as a leader with his own legacy. This desire for a lasting symbol planted the first seed of the Triple Palace, the birth of a monumental idea. Just 1 year after his father's death, William Henry Vanderbilt purchased a large piece of land on Fifth Avenue. At that time, Fifth Avenue was already known for luxury, but it was still growing. Wealthy families built one grand mansion after another, each trying to outshine the other. The land William Henry bought was once part of a farm owned by Isaiah Kaiser, positioned directly across from St. Patrick's Cathedral. It was the perfect location to make a bold statement. Instead of building just one home, William Henry made a surprising decision. He wanted a property that could house himself and two of his daughters, Cornelia and Margaret, all under one enormous roof. But he didn't want it to feel like one giant building stuffed with separate apartments. He wanted 3 massive homes, each with its own private entrance, its own halls, its own rooms, and its own identity, connected subtly in a way that still made them feel united. The result would eventually be called the Triple Palace, a name that captured its magnificence perfectly. Designing 3 palaces in one. To bring this idea to life, William Henry hired 2 talented architects, John B. Snook and Charles B. Atwood. Their job was not simple. They had to design 3 mansions that looked separate from the outside, but flowed together from the inside. Each home needed grand staircases, ballrooms, dining rooms, libraries, art rooms, and bedrooms. The combined structure needed to stretch across the entire block, rising tall and proud above Fifth Avenue. While Snook was listed officially as the architect, many experts believe that Atwood and the famous Herder brothers, well-known designers of the era, played larger roles than they were publicly credited for. In fact, there were even debates about who truly deserved recognition for the mansion's design. Letters appeared in newspapers arguing over whose imagination should be celebrated. The confusion only added to the mansion's mystery. As construction continued, hundreds of workers filled the site. Marble arrived from Europe. Woodwork was carved by expert hands. Steel beams were installed, a cutting-edge technique at the time, and soon the Triple Palace became one of the earliest large homes in New York to use a steel frame, a feature normally reserved for early skyscrapers. Rooms filled with imagination and power. By 1882, the Triple Palace was nearly complete. It stretched across the block like an enormous royal estate. The southern section belonged to William Henry, while the 2 northern sections housed his daughters and their families. Inside, each room had its own personality. Some rooms reflected French styles, while others were inspired by Italian palaces or English manor houses. The designs mixed European cultures with American creativity, creating a unique blend that only a Vanderbilt home could achieve. The ground floor of William Henry's section held a dining room large enough for elaborate dinners, a library where he kept his growing collection of books, and a drawing room decorated with shining crystal and golden accents. The second floor held bedrooms filled with fine fabrics, carved furniture, and delicate lighting. Further inside, a massive ballroom connected 2 parts of the palace, creating a space so large that it could hold hundreds of people for social events, dances, and gatherings. The Triple Palace quickly became known as one of the most magnificent homes in New York City, a celebration of status and ambition. When the Vanderbilts moved in, the mansion transformed Fifth Avenue forever. Society pages wrote about it. Visitors stared at it. Wealthy families admired it and felt inspired or intimidated by its beauty. Some even tried to build their own palaces to match its scale, which eventually helped Fifth Avenue become the most luxurious avenue in the world. Inside the Triple Palace, events became legendary. The most talked about parties included lively dances, glittering dinners, and gatherings filled with New York's most important families. Many called it the heartbeat of Fifth Avenue because the Triple Palace was not only a home, it was a stage where the Vanderbilt family displayed their power. But even the greatest palaces cannot escape time. And soon, the Triple Palace would begin its slow journey toward a surprising and heartbreaking end. The Triple Palace becomes the crown of Fifth Avenue. Once the Vanderbilt Triple Palace opened its doors, the reaction across New York City was immediate. People who walked along Fifth Avenue found themselves slowing down, staring up at the enormous structure that looked more like a royal compound than a private residence. Carriages often stopped in front of the mansion as visitors admired the carved stonework, the iron gates, and the endless rows of windows. Newspapers described the building as a palace built for an emperor, and many New Yorkers quietly believed it surpassed every other mansion on the avenue, including those owned by the Astors and the Rockefellers. Inside the Triple Palace, the Vanderbilt family created a world that most Americans could only imagine. Guests who entered the building stepped into an entrance hall filled with glowing chandeliers, polished floors, and towering columns. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers, as arrangements were changed daily to match the colors of the rooms. In the evenings, live music filled the halls as orchestras played waltzes and soft classical pieces. Extravagant dinners stretched late into the night, with tables set using the finest silver and crystal the Vanderbilts could buy. These gatherings became symbols of the family's importance, especially during the winter social season, when New York's elite tried to prove their status through appearances. Although the Triple Palace looked united from the outside, the interior revealed three separate homes with their own personalities. William Henry Vanderbilt's section was the largest and most formal. His daughter's sections were smaller, but still enormous compared to most mansions of the time. Each area had its own servants, private staircases, kitchens, and parlors. The connected design allowed the family to remain close to one another while still having privacy whenever they needed it. As the years passed, the Triple Palace became a landmark, not just for its architecture, but also for what it represented. It showed how quickly wealth could transform a street, how powerful families shaped the city around them, and how luxury could become a part of everyday life for those born into privilege. It also marked the moment when Fifth Avenue officially became America's most prestigious address. Once the Vanderbilts built their enormous homes there, other rich families followed, turning the avenue into a line of grand palaces stretching for blocks. People visiting New York often walked along Fifth Avenue just to see the mansions, treating it almost like a museum of wealth. But behind these glittering scenes lay a story that would soon shift dramatically. The days of endless money and constant building were slowly coming to an end, even if no one realized it at the time. William Henry Vanderbilt's final years inside the palace. Despite creating the most impressive residence in New York, William Henry Vanderbilt did not enjoy his new home for as long as he had hoped. Only a few years after completing the Triple Palace, his health began to decline. Although he continued to work hard and manage his vast empire, the pressure took its toll. During these final years, William Henry walked the halls of the mansion he had built, not just as a home, but as a symbol of his victory over the doubts of his father. He had proven himself worthy. He had built something that could stand for generations. But in 1885, less than 5 years after the Triple Palace was finished, William Henry Vanderbilt passed away at the age of 64. His death sent waves of sadness through New York society, which understood that they were witnessing the departure of a man who helped shape the nation's industry. Although he was gone, the mansion continued to represent his legacy. His will ensured that the home would remain in the family, with his wife Maria receiving lifetime rights to the property, and his youngest son George taking ownership in the future. With William Henry gone, the Triple Palace entered a new era, one shaped not by construction and celebration, but by the daily lives of the family members who still lived within its towering walls. A new generation carries the torch. As the 1890s arrived, the Vanderbilt family used the Triple Palace in a way that transformed it from a private home to a significant part of New York's social life. Dinners grew larger, balls became more spectacular. Influential people from across the country gathered in the massive ballroom, which stretched from one side of the building to the other. At many of these events, guests wore jewels that sparkled in the candlelight and gowns designed exclusively for these occasions. Reporters often covered these gatherings in the society pages, describing them as some of the most elegant events in the city. One of the most famous events held in the Triple Palace was the Vanderbilt Ball, which became a perfect symbol of Gilded Age luxury. Guests arrived in carriages, stepping onto Fifth Avenue dressed in clothing imported from Europe. Inside the palace, the musicians played into the early morning, as guests danced and toasted to the success of the Vanderbilt family. People who attended the party often spoke of it for years afterward, treating it almost like a royal event. Newspapers described it as a moment that changed New York's social scene forever. Because of events like these, the Triple Palace became known as a cultural hub as well as a private residence. Artists came to perform, writers found inspiration, politicians visited to discuss ideas. The mansion was no longer just a showcase of wealth. It became an influence on the city's identity. Fifth Avenue began to represent more than expensive houses. It became a place where culture and society intertwined. The Triple Palace transforms Fifth Avenue forever. The mansion's impact on New York architecture cannot be overstated. Before the Vanderbilts arrived, Fifth Avenue was growing, but it had not yet reached the level of grandeur that later made it famous. The Triple Palace changed everything. Its presence encouraged other wealthy families to build homes that matched or rivaled its beauty. This competition created an avenue filled with palaces, each designed to stand out. Architects experimented with styles such as French Gothic, Italian Renaissance, and Beaux-Arts, all inspired by European traditions, but adapted to American tastes. As these new mansions appeared, Fifth Avenue slowly developed into the world's most luxurious residential street. Tourists began to visit the avenue purely to admire the architecture. Travel guides included it as a must-see attraction. People who lived far from the city dreamed of walking down Fifth Avenue one day to see the enormous homes of the American elite. The Triple Palace stood at the center of this transformation. While every mansion contributed something, none had the same scale, the same ambition, or the same message. It was a reminder of how quickly wealth could reshape a city when placed in the hands of a single powerful family. But even as Fifth Avenue reached its golden age, change was coming fast. New York was growing, businesses were expanding, the economy was shifting. Soon the city would value commercial buildings more than personal palaces, and the Triple Palace, once a symbol of success, would slowly begin its journey toward a fate no one expected. The mansion that had shocked the city with its beauty would eventually shock it again, through its disappearance. A new century brings new pressures to Fifth Avenue. As the 1900s approached, New York City began to change faster than anyone had expected. The same streets that were once quiet and lined with elegant homes were now becoming crowded with shops, hotels, offices, and streetcars. The city's population was exploding, and businesses were desperate to find space near the center of activity. Fifth Avenue, once protected by wealthy families who believed it would always remain residential, suddenly found itself in the path of unstoppable growth. Buildings that seemed permanent in the 1880s were now standing in the way of progress. The Triple Palace remained as impressive as ever, but the world around it was transforming. New stores appeared only a few blocks away. Hotels began rising near Central Park. Traffic increased to the point where Fifth Avenue was sometimes filled from morning until night. People who lived in the area complained about the noise, the smells, and the constant movement. The peaceful environment that had once attracted the wealthy was slowly disappearing. Inside the Triple Palace, the Vanderbilt family still hosted elegant gatherings, but even they could sense the change happening outside. The younger generation of Vanderbilts talked about moving farther uptown, toward quieter neighborhoods near the 60s and 70s where new mansions were being built. Some family members even considered moving to the countryside for more privacy. The idea that Fifth Avenue might no longer be the best place to live would have shocked people in earlier years, but the pressure of the city made the thought more realistic than ever. Businesses, meanwhile, began offering enormous sums of money for land on Fifth Avenue. store owners and developers believed the avenue was perfect for luxury commerce. They imagined tall department stores, office buildings, and showrooms. They saw Fifth Avenue not as a place for families, but as a golden opportunity for profit. And soon, these business desires would collide with the world of old money families who had spent decades building their mansions there. Fifth Avenue's fall from a residential paradise. By the early 1910s, the shift became impossible to ignore. Families who had once promised never to leave Fifth Avenue quietly sold their homes and moved elsewhere. Mansions that had taken years to build were torn down or converted into clubs, galleries, and schools. The rich could no longer control the avenue the way they once did, and the power they had over the neighborhood slowly faded. The Triple Palace stood firm, like a stubborn reminder of the past. Its massive stone walls, tall windows, and enormous footprint made it seem as if it would last forever. But the changing neighborhood created an uncomfortable truth. A home built for royalty was now surrounded by crowds, traffic, and growing commercial activity. The once gentle sounds of horses and carriages had been replaced by the constant rumble of automobiles and streetcars. Even the Vanderbilts themselves began to feel out of place. Younger family members favored simpler homes, smaller estates, or residences outside Manhattan. Their taste in architecture changed as well, drifting away from the heavy European designs that dominated the Gilded Age. They wanted brighter rooms, simpler walls, and a more modern look. The Triple Palace, with its heavy decorations and enormous spaces, no longer matched the world they lived in. Most importantly, the cost of maintaining the Triple Palace became overwhelming. The mansion required servants, cleaners, electricians, gardeners, and repair workers. Heating the home during winter took huge amounts of coal and money. Maintaining the ballrooms, staircases, elevators, and large windows turned into a constant responsibility. What once felt like a symbol of success now became a financial weight. The beginning of the end for the Triple Palace. When Maria Louisa Vanderbilt, the widow of William Henry Vanderbilt, passed away in 1896, the future of the Triple Palace became uncertain. While the mansion continued to operate as a grand residence, but it no longer served the unified family purpose it once did. Smaller households replaced the lively gatherings. Large rooms remained empty for weeks at a time. The halls that once held music and voices grew quiet. After Maria's death, the southern section of the palace passed to George Vanderbilt, the youngest son. However, George rarely used the home. He preferred traveling, studying, and investing in his own projects, including the creation of Biltmore Estate, the largest privately owned home in the United States. Compared to Biltmore, the Triple Palace felt outdated and less meaningful to him. Because of this, the mansion slowly lost the emotional connection that held it together. As the years passed, the family realized that keeping such a massive structure alive made little financial sense. The mansion was simply too large for modern living and too expensive for a world moving rapidly toward efficiency. The final decision was made quietly. The Triple Palace would eventually be sold, but selling such a grand home was not simple. Business developers wanted the land, not the building. And so, the fate of the Triple Palace was sealed. No matter how beautiful or historic it was, its value in the eyes of the city was measured only by the commercial space it could become. A palace reduced to rubble. In the 1920s, Fifth Avenue completed its transformation from a quiet stretch of elite mansions to a booming commercial center. Luxury stores lined the sidewalks. New towers rose quickly. As more wealthy families moved uptown, the Vanderbilt Triple Palace found itself surrounded by developments that made it seem old-fashioned and out of place. After years of hesitation, the family finally agreed to let the historic structure be demolished. The decision shocked some New Yorkers, especially those who considered the mansion a masterpiece of American architecture. Yet the financial reality was stronger than nostalgia. The land was simply too valuable to hold a private home. Workers soon arrived with tools and machines. The first steps involved removing artwork, furniture, and anything that could be saved. Once the interior was emptied, the slow and painful process of demolition began. Walls that had taken craftsmen months to carve came down in a matter of days. The grand ballroom, where hundreds of guests once danced under brilliant lights, fell apart piece by piece. Staircases that had echoed with footsteps for decades collapsed into piles of stone and dust. People passing by stood in silent disbelief as the enormous palace disappeared from view. The demolition marked more than the end of a mansion. It symbolized the end of an era. The Gilded Age, with all its extravagance, ambition, and excess, officially faded as the last stones of the Triple Palace hit the ground. When the rubble cleared, a towering commercial building replaced the mansion. The block that once held one of America's greatest private homes became another part of New York's modern business district. The rise of Louis Comfort Tiffany's dazzling world. While the Vanderbilt Triple Palace was vanishing from Fifth Avenue, another mansion, equally breathtaking in beauty and craftsmanship, was living its own dramatic story. This was the legendary home of Louis Comfort Tiffany, the brilliant artist who transformed glass into glowing masterpieces and shaped American design in ways that still influence us today. His mansion, which once stood proudly on 72nd Street and Madison Avenue, was a dream made of carved wood, painted walls, colorful windows, and endless creativity. It was not only a home, but a powerful sign of what art could become when guided by imagination. Louis Comfort Tiffany was born into a world already surrounded by beauty. His father, Charles Louis Tiffany, had created the famous jewelry company Tiffany & Co., while his mother surrounded the family with elegance and culture. Growing up in such an environment, Louis developed a deep love for colors, shapes, and nature. He studied painting, traveled through Europe, learned from masters, and quickly became a rising star in the art world. But as he explored more forms of art, metalwork, pottery, interior design, and especially stained glass, Louis realized he needed a space where he could express every artistic idea without limits. He wanted a home that would not simply shelter him, but inspire him, something that reflected his inner world, something that stood apart from anything typical. That dream became the Tiffany Mansion, a home built from imagination, crafted by a master. To create this extraordinary place, Louis Comfort Tiffany partnered with architect Stanford White, one of the most famous designers of the era. Together, they created a residence that looked like a European castle sprinkled with touches from Asia, the Middle East, and classical art, an architectural blend that only Tiffany could imagine. The mansion rose 5 stories high and stretched across several building lots. Its exterior looked like a fortress, with turrets, thick walls, and a sweeping roofline. Some critics did not understand it, calling it too unusual for a private home. But others admired its boldness, realizing it was not meant to look like anything ordinary. It was meant to look like Louis Comfort Tiffany's mind. Inside, the mansion dazzled guests instantly. Warm golden lights glowed through stained glass windows. The walls were decorated with intricate wood carvings and hand-painted patterns inspired by nature. Hallways felt like art galleries. Rooms glimmered with carefully designed lamps, shimmering mosaics, and surfaces that caught and reflected light in surprising ways. But the true marvel of the mansion was Tiffany's personal studio. His main studio space spread across the upper floors, with a spectacular wall of 15 massive glass panels that allowed sunlight to pour inside. These windows made the rooms glow in shifting colors throughout the day. This was where Tiffany experimented with new glass techniques, designed windows for churches and mansions around the world, and created some of the most famous pieces of American decorative art. The mansion was not only a home, it was a laboratory for creativity, an exhibition hall, and a gathering place for artists and thinkers. In this one building, Louis Comfort Tiffany changed the direction of American design, a magnet for New York's elite and a center of artistic life. As the 1890s and early 1900s unfolded, the Tiffany Mansion became one of the most fashionable addresses in New York. Guests entered a world unlike anything they had ever seen. The floors shimmered with inlaid wood. The ceilings soared overhead with painted scenes. The lights glowed softly through glass, shaped and colored by Tiffany's own hands. Wealthy families, designers, collectors, and foreign visitors all wanted to see what Tiffany was creating. He hosted private gatherings, elegant dinners, and artistic exhibitions in his home. These were not simply social events. They were experiences, where every room revealed a new idea. People left the mansion inspired, wondering how one person could bring so many art forms together so effortlessly. During World War I, the mansion became even more meaningful. While some homes closed their doors during difficult times, Tiffany opened his. He supported the Red Cross, invited volunteers to train in the building, and even set aside rooms for medical workers and charity projects. A mansion built for beauty became a place for service, showing that Tiffany's values extended far beyond luxury. Yet, even in these bright moments, trouble quietly grew in the background. Cracks beneath the beauty. By the early 1920s, the Tiffany family began facing financial difficulties. Maintaining the enormous home became harder with each passing year. Repairs were constant. The building required skilled workers, specialized cleaning, and steady funding. Even the beautiful stained glass needed attention due to shifting temperatures and natural wear. In addition to this, some of Tiffany's businesses began to struggle. Public tastes were changing, and many people now wanted simpler, modern designs instead of the richly decorated style that Tiffany was famous for. The art world was undergoing a transformation, and the Tiffany aesthetic, once exciting and bold, was slowly becoming less fashionable. The beautiful mansion, once a glowing symbol of the artist's triumph, became heavy with responsibility. Costs soared higher and higher. The property needed more money than the family could comfortably provide. Attempts were made to raise funds, but each effort only temporarily solved the problem. The Tiffany Mansion, once the brightest artistic landmark in New York, now faced a difficult truth. It could not survive the pressures of a changing world. The heartbreaking demolition of a masterpiece. After Louis Comfort Tiffany died in 1933, the situation grew even more dire. Within only 3 years, in 1936, the mansion was demolished. Workers dismantled the tower, the stained glass windows, the carved staircases, and the hallways that once glowed with artistic life. New Yorkers who understood the importance of the home were heartbroken. Critics, historians, and artists all saw the demolition as a tremendous cultural loss. A masterpiece had vanished, not because it was unloved, but because it was too magnificent for the reality surrounding it. Where the Tiffany Mansion once stood, new buildings rose in its place, practical, efficient, and ordinary. They did their job, but they did not inspire anyone. The street felt emptier without the glow of Tiffany's windows. Yet this loss would not be forgotten. How a tragedy became a turning point for historic preservation. The destruction of the Tiffany Mansion shocked New York deeply. People realized that the city was losing its greatest architectural treasures far too easily. One masterpiece after another was being demolished in the name of progress, without anyone fighting hard enough to protect them. This public frustration eventually led to a major turning point. In 1965, New York City created the Landmarks Preservation Commission, a powerful organization dedicated to identifying and saving historic buildings, before it was too late. This movement later protected irreplaceable landmarks such as Grand Central Terminal, the Villard houses, and countless others. In a way, Louis Comfort Tiffany's demolished mansion became a silent supporter of every preservation victory that came afterward. Its loss became a lesson the city refused to repeat. Even without its physical structure, the spirit of the Tiffany Mansion still survives. It lives in museums, in films, in books, and in the stories told by those who understand what once stood there. It lives in every stained glass lamp, every shimmering window, and every person who recognizes the magic of Tiffany's art. The mansion may be gone, but the legacy of its light remains unbroken. The Astor family's battle for dominance and the birth of the Waldorf legend. While artistic brilliance shaped the Tiffany Mansion and quiet elegance defined the Schwab estate, another story was unfolding in New York City. One built not on creativity or family warmth, but on rivalry. It was a family conflict so intense that it transformed Fifth Avenue forever and helped create two of the most famous hotels the world had ever seen. At the center of this saga were two cousins, William Waldorf Astor and John Jacob Astor IV. They belonged to one of America's oldest, richest, and most powerful families. The Astors controlled shipping, real estate, and massive tracts of Manhattan land. Their wealth was so enormous that by the late 1800s, people said, the Astors own New York. But wealth rarely brings peace. Within the Astor family, relationships were complicated, especially between William and his aunt, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, Known simply as Mrs. Astor, she ruled the city's high society like a queen, deciding who was important enough to attend the city's most fashionable events. When she favored other relatives over William, a deep resentment began forming. This bitterness would lead to the creation of the Waldorf Hotel. A mansion becomes a battlefield, and a hotel rises from pride. In the 1890s, William Waldorf Astor inherited his father's mansion at the corner of 5th Avenue and 33rd Street. This was prime land surrounded by the homes of the elite, but he had no interest in staying near Mrs. Astor, who lived right next door in her own mansion. Annoyed by their rivalry, William decided to do something drastic. He tore down his father's mansion and built a grand hotel on the site, a building so luxurious that its opening shocked New York society. This hotel, the original Waldorf, rose 12 stories high, towering over the stately homes that once lined the avenue. Its richly decorated rooms, glittering chandeliers, and lavish banquet halls represented everything modern and exciting. Some people were outraged. They claimed a hotel did not belong in such a refined neighborhood. Others saw it as a bold symbol of the new era. But everyone understood what William had done. He had placed a giant reminder of his power right beside the home of the woman who had excluded him from her social empire. The feud was now built in stone. John Jacob Astor IV answers the challenge. Across the street, John Jacob Astor IV, younger, ambitious, and eager to surpass his cousin, watched the Waldorf rise. He believed he could outshine it. Inspired by European palaces, he imagined a hotel so elegant that it would eclipse the Waldorf entirely. So, he purchased the land beside his mother's mansion and constructed an even grander structure, naming it the Astoria Hotel. Taller, more ornate, and filled with advanced amenities, the Astoria became the rival to the Waldorf. But this rivalry did not last long because businessmen quickly saw something else. Combining both hotels into one gigantic luxury complex would create the most impressive hotel in the world. The two cousins reluctantly agreed. Their buildings were connected by a marble corridor known as Peacock Alley. With this union, the Waldorf Astoria was born, creating a single stunning hotel that instantly became the center of elite life in New York. Together, the hotels had hundreds of rooms, lavish dining halls, golden ceilings, and spectacular ballrooms where society gathered for charity events, political celebrations, and royal visits. The Waldorf Astoria became the heartbeat of high society, a palace for the powerful and the most famous meeting place in America. Yet, even as the hotel flourished, Fifth Avenue continued to change, and not for the better. A golden palace crushed by time and progress, the Waldorf Astoria enjoyed years of fame, hosting presidents, dignitaries, entertainers, and wealthy travelers from around the world. Its restaurants were world famous, its parties were legendary, its hallways buzzed with conversation from every corner of society. At night, its rooms glowed like lanterns against the city skyline. But the world moved on. By the early 1900s, the wealthy families who once lived on Fifth Avenue were leaving. Noise from traffic grew louder, shops crowded the sidewalks, and new skyscrapers blocked the sunlight. Mansions that once stood proudly now looked out of place beside towering commercial developments. The hotel remained profitable for a while, but newer buildings with modern elevators, stronger steel frames, and more efficient layouts began to overshadow it. The Waldorf Astoria, designed in the lavish 19th century style, could not compete forever with the streamlined technology of the 1920s. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, luxury travel dropped sharply. The enormous cost of maintaining the building strained its owners, and developers began eyeing its land, the same land that had once belonged to the Astor family, as a perfect location for something even bigger. That something bigger would change New York's skyline forever. The Empire State Building replaces a legend. In the late 1920s, the land beneath the Waldorf Astoria was sold. Plans were announced for a skyscraper taller than any the world had ever seen. The hotel closed its doors, and the once glittering corridors became silent. Workers took down the chandeliers, removed the carpets, emptied the kitchens, and carefully stripped the building of anything valuable. Then the demolition began. One by one, the walls fell. The ornate ceilings, the marble pillars, the decorated hallways, and the sweeping staircases were all reduced to rubble. New Yorkers watched with mixed emotions: sadness for the loss of an icon, excitement for the modern marvel taking its place. By 1931, the Empire State Building opened on the same site, instantly becoming the tallest building in the world. Where elegant chefs once prepared meals for kings and presidents, steel beams now stretched into the clouds. The Waldorf Astoria name did not die, however. A new hotel bearing the name opened on Park Avenue shortly afterward. But the original structure, the place that symbolized rivalry, wealth, and American luxury, was gone forever. A reminder of how fast a city can change. With the fall of the Vanderbilt mansions, the destruction of the Schwab Palace, the loss of the Tiffany Mansion, and now the disappearance of the Waldorf Astoria, New York City revealed a hard truth. Even the grandest structures are not safe from progress. Buildings that seem permanent can vanish in months. Neighborhoods transform in the blink of an eye. The stories of these vanished Gilded Age mansions show how a city always chooses growth over memories. But they also show something else: how these buildings shaped culture, inspired creativity, and defined the spirit of an era when wealth was displayed like a crown. Even though many of them no longer stand, their stories continue to echo through books, films, museums, and the imaginations of people who wonder what New York once looked like. And the next mansion to face this fate would be even older, even more mysterious, and even more beloved than the hotels or palaces before it. That mansion was the Dakota. The Dakota, a strange castle, rises far from the city's heart. Long before it became a landmark of mystery, tragedy, and celebrity life, the Dakota was considered a daring experiment, almost a risky gamble. When it was built in the early 1880s, most New Yorkers believed the Upper West Side was too far away from everything important. At that time, the city's cultural and social energy lived below 59th Street. Wealthy families built their mansions around Fifth Avenue and Central Park South, not miles uptown. Anything past the park felt isolated, empty, and even rural. Yet one man saw a different future. Edward Clark, the wealthy head of the Singer Sewing Machine Company, imagined a new type of living: luxurious apartment life on a grand scale. He believed New Yorkers would eventually crave the comfort and safety of apartment living without sacrificing elegance. In his mind, the city needed a building that offered the luxury of a mansion with the convenience of modern living. So he took a bold step and decided to build such a place himself. When Clark chose the remote site on 72nd Street, people shook their heads. They said the location was so far from active neighborhoods that it might as well be in the Dakota Territory, which was hundreds of miles away. The nickname stuck, and Clark embraced it. He proudly called the development the Dakota, a name that suggested both independence and vision. Little did anyone know that his risky idea would eventually become one of the most celebrated and iconic residences in America, a fortress of beauty, mystery, and European inspiration. Construction began with grand ambition. The Dakota was designed to resemble a European castle, complete with turrets, gables, archways, and carved ornaments. The exterior was built with red brick and sandstone, colors that captured the sunlight differently at every hour of the day. Some people thought the building looked too dark, too heavy, or too dramatic, but others admired its bold presence and the way it towered over the quiet landscape. Inside, the Dakota felt even more extraordinary. The wide hallways, tall ceilings, and huge oak doors gave the building a sense of importance usually reserved for palaces. Each apartment was designed like a private home, with fireplaces, massive living rooms, decorative woodwork, and thick walls that provided silence in the middle of the growing city. Large windows faced Central Park, catching the beauty of golden sunsets and snowy mornings. More importantly, Clark wanted the Dakota to be self-sufficient. The building included its own heating system, laundry rooms, servants' quarters, and even special hallways where staff could move discreetly without disturbing residents. These ideas were far ahead of their time. Modern apartment buildings still use concepts that were first tested here. The Dakota wasn't just a residence, it was a statement. It announced that luxury living did not need to be tied to one part of the city. A palace could stand anywhere, as long as it was built with vision, a home for artists, thinkers, and world-changing voices. By the early 1900s, the Dakota had become widely admired. It attracted writers, musicians, painters, actors, and creative thinkers who were drawn to its atmosphere. Unlike many wealthy homes of the era, the Dakota felt welcoming to people who valued imagination as much as money. Artists like Edward Hopper, writers like Edith Wharton, and musicians like Leonard Bernstein lived within its walls. They saw the building not just as a place to sleep, but as a quiet retreat where creativity could grow. While some residents preferred privacy, others enjoyed the lively conversations that sometimes filled the hallways or the courtyard. The building developed a reputation as a sanctuary for talent. The Dakota also stayed strong during economic hardships like the Great Depression. While other luxury buildings struggled, the Dakota remained desirable. Its charm, design, and history protected its value even during times when the world outside suffered. Wealthy New Yorkers continued to seek it out, knowing they were securing not only a home, but a piece of cultural history. Hollywood discovers the Dakota. As decades passed, the Dakota gained even more fame. Its dramatic exterior and Gothic features caught the eye of filmmakers who wanted locations that looked mysterious, elegant, and slightly haunting. Movies such as Rosemary's Baby used the building as a backdrop, and television productions often featured it when they needed images of old New York charm. The Dakota was no longer just a building. It had become a symbol, a character in stories that reached millions. People began visiting the building simply to look at it, photograph it, or admire its details. Tourists paused at its front gate. Writers described it as a European castle in the middle of Manhattan. The building's reputation grew each year, blending myth with reality. But the most defining moment in the Dakota's history, and the saddest, was still to come. The tragedy that changed the building forever. On the night of December 8, 1980, the world changed at the Dakota's entrance. John Lennon, legendary musician and member of the Beatles, returned home with his wife, Yoko Ono. As they approached the archway of the building, a man stepped forward and shot Lennon 4 times. The news spread instantly across the globe, leaving millions devastated. People gathered outside the Dakota holding candles, singing Lennon's songs, and grieving together. For days, the sidewalk became a sea of flowers, photos, tears, and messages from fans. Even today, the area remains a quiet memorial for one of the world's most beloved musicians. Inside the Dakota, the mood shifted permanently. Residents mourned the loss of a neighbor who had brought music, peace, and kindness to the world. The building, once famous for elegance and artistry, became forever linked to a moment of heartbreaking violence. Yoko Ono continued to live in the Dakota after Lennon's death. She turned their home into a place of remembrance filled with art, photographs, and memories. Her presence kept Lennon's spirit alive in the building, and she later helped create Strawberry Fields, the peaceful section of Central Park's dedicated to him. From grief to renewal, the Dakota adapts again. In the years that followed Lennon's death, the Dakota struggled with its public image. Some people felt the building carried sadness. Others wanted to move past the tragedy. But through it all, the Dakota remained strong. It tightened its security, improved the screening of new residents, and made sure the building stayed safe and welcoming. As decades passed, the Dakota regained its image as one of the most exclusive and desirable homes in New York. Celebrities, authors, business leaders, and creative figures sought to live there. The building combined old-world charm with modern safety and convenience, creating an environment impossible to copy elsewhere. Renovations in the 2000s and 2010s strengthened its structure, updated its systems, and preserved its original beauty. Today, the Dakota stands as a perfect blend of past and present, a building that has survived tragedy, mystery, and passing trends, yet still shines with the same elegance it held in 1884. But even the Dakota, with all its grandeur, is part of a bigger story, the story of New York's constant cycle of building, destroying, remembering, and rebuilding. The Great Gatsby's world takes shape on Long Island, while Manhattan filled with skyscrapers and commercial towers, another landscape, quiet, green, and glittering with wealth, began shaping a very different chapter of American history. This was Long Island's Gold Coast, a stretch of shoreline so thick with mansions, private docks, and endless parties that it became a world entirely of its own. It was a place where old money families hid behind iron gates, new millionaires tried to prove themselves, and every summer evening seemed to shimmer with champagne, music, and the sound of ocean winds moving through massive gardens. It was here that F. Scott Fitzgerald found the inspiration for one of America's greatest novels, The Great Gatsby. When he moved to Great Neck in the early 1920s, Fitzgerald was young, talented, and eager to understand the secrets of wealth. From his modest home, he could see across the water to some of the richest homes in the world. At night, the lights from these palaces flickered across the surface of the bay. Parties erupted in houses so large that hundreds of guests could crowd into a single ballroom. Fitzgerald watched all of this closely. He saw the fancy cars, the loud parties, and the glamorous figures who danced late into the night. But he also sensed something beneath the glitter, something lonely, something false, something tragic. The Gold Coast was beautiful, but it was also filled with people pretending to be happier than they truly were. This land of shining mansions, whispers of love, and rivers of money became the perfect stage for the story of Jay Gatsby. Beacon Towers. The real Gatsby mansion rises above the sea. Among the grand homes that surrounded Fitzgerald, one stood out more than the others. It was so strange, so magnificent, and so dreamlike that people compared it to a fantasy castle sprouting from the American coastline. This was Beacon Towers, a mansion built by Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, one of the most influential and determined women of the Gilded Age. Beacon Towers was unlike any other home in America. Designed with Gothic spires, enormous turrets, pointed arches, long balconies, and stone walls that glowed white in the sunlight, it looked like a castle transported from Europe and placed directly on the cliffs above Long Island Sound. Its windows faced the water, and its towers cast long shadows across the gardens. Inside, Beacon Towers held more than 100 rooms. Hallways stretched to surprising lengths, hidden staircases twisted behind panels. The ceilings rose high above the marble floors. The air inside smelled faintly of polished wood, fresh linens, and sea breeze drifting through the balconies. The mansion felt magical, mysterious, and slightly haunting. An ideal reflection of Gatsby's fictional home, which Fitzgerald described as an imitation of a European estate, glowing with green lawns and a marble swimming pool. Fitzgerald visited parties in mansions like Beacon Towers. He saw how people acted when surrounded by wealth beyond imagination. He felt the energy of the place, and he carried those impressions into his writing, turning them into descriptions that still captivate readers today. Beacon Towers became the architectural soul of Gatsby's mansion, beautiful, unreachable, and doomed to disappear. Land's End, elegance, luxury, and the world of Tom and Daisy. Not far from Beacon Towers stood another mansion, equally impressive but very different in atmosphere. This was Land's End, a mansion widely believed to be the model for the home of Tom and Daisy Buchanan. Where Gatsby's home was dramatic and filled with longing, the Buchanan residence symbolized old money comfort, stable, graceful, and smug. Land's End sat on a gentle rise above the shore, offering sweeping views of the water. The house was wide and elegant, with white columns, broad verandas, and manicured lawns that reached all the way to the edge of the bay. Its charm came not from mystery, but from refinement. Exactly the sort of place where Daisy Buchanan would wear soft dresses and talk quietly in rooms filled with flowers and sunlight. Fitzgerald knew this world well. He had visited homes like Land's End during his time on Long Island. He saw the distinction between old money families, calm, confident, and exclusive, and new millionaires like Gatsby who had to prove themselves constantly. The contrast between these two types of homes became one of the novel's greatest themes, turning houses into symbols of identity. Land's End represented the world of comfort that Gatsby desperately hoped to enter. But in reality, that world was impossible for him to reach. Pembroke, the mansion of unforgettable parties. Across the water from these estates stood Pembroke, a mansion where Fitzgerald likely attended some of the wildest parties of his life. Built in Glen Cove, Pembroke belonged to Captain de Lamar, a wealthy industrialist known for his generosity and taste for entertainment. Later, the home was purchased by theater businessman Marcus Loew, whose connections brought Hollywood actresses, directors, and performers to the estate. Pembroke was enormous, 60,000 square feet of marble floors, carved wood panels, glittering chandeliers, and long halls that echoed with music. Guests arrived in chauffeur-driven cars, walked past glowing lanterns, and stepped inside rooms filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Fitzgerald absorbed everything: the stepping of shoes on polished floors, the smell of cigars mixed with perfume, the sound of orchestras playing late into the night. The mansion featured its own private dock, stretching into the water like an arrow. At night, lanterns illuminated the end of the dock, creating a tiny glowing point that might have inspired the famous green light at the end of Daisy's Pier. It was a symbol of longing, distance, and the dream that always remained just out of reach. Pembroke's atmosphere of celebration and sadness lingered in Fitzgerald's memory and became the emotional heart of Gatsby's parties, bright on the surface, empty underneath. Harbor Hill, the grandest mansion of them all. If there was one estate that truly captured the scale, ambition, and excess of the Gilded Age, it was Harbor Hill, the soaring mansion built for Clarence Mackay and his glamorous wife Catherine "Kitty" Dewar Mackay. Rising high above Roslyn Harbor like a crown, Harbor Hill was composed of 80,000 square feet of elegance, making it one of the largest private homes in the United States. Built by architect Stanford White, the mansion reflected French Baroque style, complete with towers, terraces, broad stairways, and richly carved stone details. Inside, everything was customized. Marble fireplaces, delicate chandeliers, rare art, and imported furniture filled every corner. Kitty Mackay's personal suite included a marble bath carved from a single block of stone. Harbor Hill hosted events so magnificent that newspapers covered them nationally. One of the most famous was the extravagant party held for the Prince of Wales in 1924. The roof was lit with red, white, and blue lights that sparkled across the harbor. The long driveway was decorated with rows of glowing blue lamps. Hundreds of guests filled the estate until the early morning hours. The event was so bright that sailors at sea reported seeing the lights from miles away. These scenes echoed in Fitzgerald's thoughts when he described Gatsby's mansion lit as if on fire, filled with hundreds of guests and glowing brightly across the bay. Harbor Hill embodied the dream Gatsby could never truly reach. Oheka Castle, the last great palace of the Gold Coast. Standing proudly even today, Oheka Castle remains the most complete surviving example of Long Island's Golden Age. Built by Otto Hermann Kahn, a financier with boundless imagination, Oheka became one of the largest private homes in America, with 127 rooms and hundreds of acres of landscaped gardens. Unlike many other Gilded Age mansions, Oheka manages to survive not as ruins, but as a restored palace. Its long hallways, grand staircases, reflecting pools, and formal gardens capture the spirit of the era. Guests walking through its corridors can feel echoes of the world Fitzgerald once knew. The world of sparkling lights, romantic dreams, secrets, and whispered conversations beneath chandeliers. It is no surprise that Oheka served as the visual inspiration for Gatsby's mansion in the 2013 film adaptation starring Leonardo DiCaprio. Hollywood recognized what Fitzgerald had seen long ago, that this house contained the perfect mix of beauty, ambition, and fantasy. The survival of Oheka Castle reminds us that not all treasures are lost. Some live on to tell their stories. The Gold Coast fades into memory. By the end of the 1940s and 1950s, the world that inspired the Great Gatsby had begun to unravel. Large estates became too expensive to maintain. Servants became rare. Taxes rose. Many families could no longer afford their enormous homes. One by one, the great mansions were abandoned, sold, or demolished. In their place came modern developments, schools, smaller homes, and new neighborhoods. But even though the buildings disappeared, their stories remained. The Gold Coast became a legend, a symbol of wealth, beauty, love, ambition, and heartbreak. And through The Great Gatsby, it became eternal. Penn Station, the city's grand entrance to the modern world. As the mansions of the Gold Coast began to fade and the Gilded Age slowly softened into memory, another architectural story, equally dramatic and deeply emotional, was unfolding in the heart of Manhattan. This story did not revolve around a private home or a glittering ballroom. Instead, it centered on one of the most important public buildings ever constructed in the United States, the original Penn Station. Long before its destruction shocked the city, Penn Station was a monument to ambition. It was built during a period when America believed the future held no limits, when engineers dared to accomplish the impossible, and when architects imagined buildings that could rival the wonders of Europe. New York City wanted a gateway that announced its rise as a world capital, a structure that greeted travelers with dignity, beauty, and awe. The idea came from Alexander Cassatt, the powerful president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He dreamed of bringing trains directly into Manhattan from New Jersey, something no one had done before. Until then, passengers traveling from the west had to stop at the river, board ferries, and cross the Hudson to reach the city. Cassatt believed this old system was unacceptable for a modern nation. His vision was bold: to dig tunnels under the Hudson River and build a station so grand that stepping inside would feel like stepping into a European cathedral. This was not a simple task. It required courage, money, engineering genius, and a willingness to challenge the limits of technology. But Cassatt was determined, and he would not stop until the project came to life. A palace for travelers, carved in stone and flooded with light. To turn his vision into a reality, Alexander Cassatt hired the architectural firm McKim, Mead, and White, one of the greatest design teams in American history. The firm was known for their classical style, inspired by ancient Rome and the Renaissance, and they approached Penn Station with the seriousness of artists creating a masterpiece. When construction began, New Yorkers watched in amazement. Hundreds of workers moved through enormous pits, laying foundations and assembling steel skeletons. Trains would eventually glide through tunnels hidden deep underground, opening a new chapter in American transportation. In 1910, after years of effort, the original Penn Station opened its doors, and the result left visitors speechless. The entrance along 7th Avenue was lined with towering stone columns, modeled after the temples of ancient Greece. The waiting room soared more than 150 feet into the air, its ceiling carved with beautiful patterns and illuminated by sunlight that poured through giant windows. The walls were made of Roman travertine, the same stone used in the Colosseum. Each room echoed with the footsteps of travelers, the soft murmur of voices, and the low rumble of arriving trains. The main concourse was even more breathtaking. Its enormous steel and glass roof allowed natural light to flood the space, creating patterns that danced across the floor throughout the day. People who entered the building for the first time often stopped in awe. They felt small, humbled by the vastness around them, but also uplifted by the beauty. Penn Station did not simply serve a purpose. It created an experience. It reminded visitors that travel could be meaningful, even poetic. For decades, the station welcomed millions of people. Soldiers returning from war stepped into its light-filled halls. Families departed on vacations or reunions. Immigrants arriving from distant lands passed through its doors as they began new lives in America. Penn Station was more than a building. It was the city's front door, the slow decline of a masterpiece. But time can be cruel, even to legends. By the 1940s and 1950s, America was changing. Automobiles became more common, highways grew longer, airplanes replaced trains for long-distance travel. The excitement that once surrounded railroads slowly disappeared, passenger numbers fell sharply, and revenues dropped with them. The Pennsylvania Railroad, once one of the mightiest corporations in the world, began to suffer financially. Maintenance on Penn Station grew expensive. The enormous halls required constant cleaning, painting, and repairs. But the railroad no longer had the money to keep the building in pristine condition. As the years passed, soot settled on the ceiling, paint peeled, advertisements cluttered the walls. What was once a dazzling space began to feel dark and tired. Some travelers complained that stepping inside felt like stepping into a forgotten relic of a different age. Executives at the Pennsylvania Railroad started thinking not about saving Penn Station, but about how they could use its valuable land to survive. Manhattan real estate had skyrocketed in value. The airspace above the station was worth millions. Developers began proposing new ideas: an office tower, a sports arena, commercial spaces. Slowly, the idea of demolishing the original station, which once would have seemed unthinkable, became a real possibility, a decision that shocked the nation. In 1961, the Pennsylvania Railroad quietly made a decision that would change architectural history forever. They agreed to tear down the station and replace it with a new structure, a sports arena above ground and a new smaller train station buried below street level. When the news reached the public, the reaction was explosive. Architects, historians, artists, and ordinary New Yorkers were outraged. They wrote letters, organized protests, and begged the city to stop the demolition. They pointed out that Penn Station was not just a building, it was a work of art, a monument to America's past, and a symbol of what the country was capable of achieving. But financial pressure was stronger than public anger. The railroad argued that without the redevelopment, they would face bankruptcy. City officials, facing pressure of their own, approved the plan. On October 28, 1963, workers began tearing down the magnificent stone walls. People gathered to watch in disbelief as giant cranes chipped away at the massive columns. Pieces of the station were hauled off in trucks and dumped into landfills. The great waiting room, once filled with light, was smashed apart. The soaring roof of the concourse collapsed under the force of machinery. Dust filled the air, and the sound of destruction echoed through the streets. Newspapers mourned the loss, calling it a monumental act of vandalism. Some writers compared it to burning a library or destroying a priceless artwork. But it was too late. By 1968, Penn Station was completely gone. In its place stood Madison Square Garden, an arena and office complex that served its purpose, but held none of the majesty of the building that came before. Outrage becomes a movement. The birth of preservation in America. The demolition of Penn Station did something the Pennsylvania Railroad never expected. It awakened a powerful movement across the country. People realized that if a masterpiece like Penn Station could be destroyed, then any historic building could be at risk. New York residents demanded action. Activists, historians, architects, and everyday citizens united to protect what remained of the city's architectural treasures. In 1965, partly because of the public anger surrounding Penn Station, New York City created the Landmarks Preservation Commission, which gave historic buildings legal protection for the first time. This new movement saved places like Grand Central Terminal, which itself was once threatened with demolition. It helped protect countless brownstones, theaters, churches, and cultural landmarks. Penn Station, in its death, became a guardian for hundreds of other buildings across the nation. Its story turned from tragedy into legacy. A lost building that still shapes the city today. Although the original Penn Station no longer stands, its spirit remains alive in the way people think about architecture, preservation, and history. Whenever a famous building is threatened with demolition, someone always brings up Penn Station. Its image reminds people that once something extraordinary is gone, it can never be fully replaced. Photographs of the old station still circulate online. Students study it in architecture classes. Artists paint it. Filmmakers recreate it in movies. Many New Yorkers who pass through the underground station today imagine the light-filled palace that once stood above them. The story of Penn Station also fits perfectly into the larger theme of New York's lost Gilded Age. Just like the grand mansions of Fifth Avenue, the Tiffany Mansion, the Schwab Palace, and the Gold Coast Estates, Penn Station teaches us that beauty does not always last. Even the greatest creations can vanish when society chooses convenience over memory. Yet the story does not end with sorrow. It ends with understanding. An understanding that preserving beauty is not just about saving buildings, but about saving identity. Every demolished landmark changes a city's soul. Every preserved one strengthens it. In this way, Penn Station continues to influence New York long after its stones were carried away. The forgotten palaces of Fifth Avenue's earliest elite, before the Vanderbilts, before the Astors built their giant hotel rivalry, and long before Fifth Avenue transformed into the glittering commercial street we know today, Another generation quietly shaped the avenue's early identity. These were families who built elegant brownstone mansions, tree-lined residential blocks, and private gardens on what was once considered the peaceful edge of Manhattan. In the mid-1800s, Fifth Avenue was not yet a symbol of wealth. It was simply a promising stretch of land with fresh air and open views. Among these early families was Mary Mason Jones, a determined woman who became one of the first to recognize the avenue's potential. She was the great-aunt of author Edith Wharton, who later turned her into the character Mrs. Manson Mingott in The Age of Innocence. When Mary Mason Jones built her marble mansion on Fifth Avenue and 57th Street in the 1860s, people thought she was eccentric. The neighborhood was still relatively empty, with few homes and long stretches of undeveloped land. But she believed the area would soon become the center of fashionable life. Her mansion, known as Marble Row, was a block-long set of white stone houses that gleamed in the sunlight. The building's pale facades stood out sharply against the dull, brown structures around them. Inside, the homes had high ceilings, refined furnishings, and quiet parlors where New York's earliest form of high society gathered for afternoon tea and small dinners. These gatherings lacked the extravagance of the later Gilded Age, but carried their own sense of dignity. As decades passed, Mary Mason Jones watched the city grow toward her. Brownstone after brownstone appeared along the avenue. Families like the Lorellards, the Livingstons, and the Rhinelanders built large but modest homes that set the foundation for the explosion of luxury that would come later. Their mansions became stepping stones toward the architectural wonders that would eventually replace them. Yet, despite their influence, almost none of these early homes survived. Time swept them away, leaving only faint traces in old illustrations and forgotten diary entries. The rise of unheard names, families lost in the shadows of history. While famous families like the Astors and Vanderbilts dominated newspapers, many other wealthy New Yorkers lived in spectacular, yet now forgotten mansions. Their names rarely appear in modern history books, but their homes once defined entire blocks. These were families such as Alexander Stewart, the retail magnate who built one of the largest private homes in America near Fifth Avenue and 34th Street. His mansion was so colossal that people called it the Marble Palace of Madison Square. Its exterior looked like a government building, with towering stone columns, massive, doors and windows that stretched several stories high. Inside, the rooms overflowed with imported furniture, rare paintings, and expensive fabrics. Stewart spared no expense, turning the mansion into a museum of wealth. For a time, it symbolized the peak of upper-class living. But just like the mansions that came after it, Stewart's palace struggled to survive the changes of the 20th century. After his death, the mansion became tangled in family disputes. Eventually, the structure was demolished and replaced with commercial buildings. Today, hardly anyone knows it once existed. Another forgotten name is Henry Parrish, a wealthy banker whose grand mansion once stood on Fifth Avenue and 16th Street. Parrish's home was elegant and carefully designed, famous for its refined garden and beautiful interior spaces. When he died, his estate stirred public interest because of its size and the legal battles that followed. Yet within a few decades, the mansion was gone, replaced by modern development. These stories remind us that for every famous mansion we remember, dozens more vanished quietly, taking their histories with them. The doomed elegance of the Van Allen and Villar estates. As Fifth Avenue continued to grow in prestige, families hired the best architects in America to design homes that blended European influence with modern creativity. Among these architectural gems were the Villard houses, built for Henry Villard, a railroad executive with deep artistic taste. He chose the architectural firm McKim, Mead, and White, the same team behind Penn Station, to design a residence that looked like an Italian Renaissance palace. The Villard houses featured an elegant courtyard framed by arched windows, carved stone facades, and warm terracotta colors. Inside, wide staircases and painted ceilings gave the impression of an old European villa transported directly to Manhattan. Unlike many Gilded Age homes, the Villard houses were designed not just to show wealth, but to radiate harmony and balance. Surprisingly, the Villard houses almost met the same fate as the Tiffany Mansion. Developers planned to demolish them in the 1970s, but a wave of public support helped save the structures. Today, They form part of the Lotte New York Palace Hotel, proof that some historical treasures can survive when a city chooses preservation over destruction. Not as lucky was the Van Allen Mansion, an architectural masterpiece inspired by Georgian and English manor styles. Built in the early 1900s, the house boasted long brick facades, tall windows, and meticulously crafted interiors. It was admired by architects for its restraint and beauty. But as commercial development surged along the avenue, the mansion became too costly to maintain. It was eventually demolished, leaving only photographs and piece-by-piece descriptions behind. These transitions show how fragile beauty can be in a city driven by power and profit. When private palaces became public institutions, and then disappeared, many Gilded Age mansions did not simply vanish. Instead, they shifted roles, becoming museums, clubs, schools, or embassies before eventually facing demolition. One example is the William C. Whitney Mansion, an extravagant home with marble staircases and extravagant ballrooms. After Whitney's death, the mansion functioned as a temporary site for museums and private gatherings. But like many grand structures, it became too expensive to preserve as real estate prices climbed. Eventually, the mansion was lost to developers who replaced it with modern skyscrapers. Another example is the Gilded Mansion, once known for its sweeping gardens and tall wrought iron gates. Its grounds included stables, orchards, and courtyards, luxuries impossible to maintain in modern Manhattan. After the family declined, the mansion became a school, then a government office, before it too disappeared under new development. These stories reveal a pattern. The city constantly repurposed old mansions, squeezing value out of them until nothing remained. How New York's memory fragments across time. Walking down Fifth Avenue today, it is almost impossible to imagine how many palaces once lined the street. The skyscrapers of glass and steel hide the past, covering up the foundations of hundreds of homes that defined an era. The Gilded Age mansions were more than residences. They were symbols of ambition, innovation, and excess. They showed how determined people could reshape a city with money, imagination, and a desire for social dominance. But the city grew faster than any mansion could withstand. As land values soared, private homes simply could not justify their enormous footprints. A single mansion that once occupied an entire block became inefficient, and developers replaced them with structures that could house thousands of workers instead of a single family. What survived were not the buildings themselves, but the stories. The whispered legends of lost ballrooms, forgotten, staircases, vanished gardens, and great halls filled with light. The memories of these mansions linger in archives, paintings, faded photographs, and the architectural curves of buildings that replaced them. And though the structures have vanished, the imagination keeps them alive, the last breath of an era built on stone, steel, and dreams. As New York entered the late 20th century, the pattern that had shaped the city for over 100 years continued unchanged. New buildings rose, old ones vanished, and entire eras were swept away in the rush toward the future. The great palaces of Fifth Avenue, the glittering estates of the Gold Coast, the towering Penn Station, and the artistic wonder of the Tiffany Mansion were all casualties of a city that rarely pauses. Their destruction revealed a truth that sits at the heart of New York's identity, a truth that is both powerful and heartbreaking. New York grows by letting go. The mansions that once defined whole generations fell under the weight of progress. Their marble columns, carved staircases, golden ceilings, and elegant gardens were no match for the rising value of land or the pressure of modern development. Families who once symbolized wealth and royalty eventually moved away, died out, or simply lost interest in maintaining giant homes that no longer fit the era. The city changed, and the buildings that once made it magnificent were swallowed by the very streets they stood upon. But even as their stone foundations crumbled, something else quietly began to grow. Memory. How stories live where buildings no longer stand. There is a strange and beautiful thing that happens when a city loses its greatest structures. The physical walls may fall, but the stories become stronger. The Schwab Mansion is gone, yet its legend still stirs admiration. The Tiffany Mansion vanished, but its light continues to shine in museums and collectors' homes. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace exists only in photographs, yet its myth still shapes our ideas about wealth and ambition. Even Penn Station, destroyed so violently, became more famous in death than it ever was in life. These buildings taught New York a lesson it had ignored for too long. Beauty is fragile, and once it is gone, it can never be recreated with the same soul. This realization sparked a powerful desire to protect what remained. It led to preservation laws, public activism, and a renewed respect for history. Entire movements were built from the rubble of lost marble palaces. The city began to understand something vital: that the past is not an inconvenience. It is a foundation. It is a voice. It is a guide. A city built on constant rebirth. New York's identity has always been shaped by contrast. The old fights the new. Memory collides with ambition. History stands in the shadow of skyscrapers. The very streets echo with layers of time stacked on top of one another. It is a place where a 200-year-old brownstone can sit beside a 70-story tower, where faded cornices coexist with glittering glass walls. This blend of eras gives New York its character, and the vanished mansions are part of that character more than many people realize. They live in the city's DNA, influencing architecture, literature, movies, fashion, and cultural imagination. The echoes of their ballrooms appear in the grand lobbies of hotels. Their sweeping staircases inspire the curves of modern towers. Their lost gardens whisper through the quiet corners of Central Park. New York never forgets completely. It remembers in pieces, the final legacy of the lost Gilded Age. When we look back at the great mansions of the Gilded Age, we see more than demolished houses. We see dreams turned into stone. We see ambition carved into architecture. We see the determination of people who wanted to prove something, to society, to family, to themselves. These mansions were not just homes, they were messages. The Vanderbilts wanted to show the country what new wealth could achieve. Louis Comfort Tiffany wanted to prove that art could rise from glass and light. Charles Schwab wanted to stand proudly among the giants of industry. The Gold Coast families wanted to celebrate prosperity and escape from reality. The builders of Penn Station wanted to create a gateway worthy of a nation. Each structure represented a story, and each story became part of New York's collective memory. Their endings were often sad: demolition, abandonment, or decay. But their impact remains powerful. They remind us that beauty is not permanent, but its imprint can last centuries. They remind us that a city is not defined only by what stands, but also by what has been lost. New York today. A city that carries its ghosts. Walk down Fifth Avenue today and look closely. Beneath the glass walls and storefronts, beneath the rush of taxis and the glow of neon, the ghosts of the Gilded Age still linger. You can feel them in the wide sidewalks where carriages once rolled. You can sense them in the shadows of modern towers built on the footprints of vanished palaces. You can almost hear faint echoes of orchestras playing in ballrooms that no longer exist, or the quiet footsteps of servants walking down hidden hallways now buried beneath skyscraper foundations. These ghosts do not haunt the city. They enrich it. They give New York a depth unlike any other place in the world. They remind every visitor and every resident that this city has lived many lives, and each life left behind a trace. New York is not simply a city of the present. It is a museum of stories, a collection of ruins invisible to the eye but vivid in imagination. What the lost mansions truly mean. The Gilded Age mansions of New York may have been destroyed, but their disappearance taught the city something priceless. They showed that progress without memory is empty. They revealed that beauty must be protected, celebrated, and fought for. They proved that even in loss, there can be meaning. New York is a place built on ambition, but it survives on remembrance. A place built on dreams, but strengthened by history. A place built on towers of steel, but shaped by palaces now vanished. The lost mansions of New York are gone, but their stories remain alive, powerful, and unforgettable. And in the end, that is their greatest legacy.